Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Research Podcast.
Great to be back.
Today we're jumping into something that's just been all over the headlines everywhere. We're doing a deep dive into the really intricate and honestly rapidly evolving situation between Israel and Iran.
Yeah, intricate is definitely the word.
Yeah.
And rapidly evolving almost feels like an understatement sometimes.
Really does. And this isn't just about, catching up on the latest breaking news alerts. We want to try and peel back some of those layers of information.
Exactly. Understand the dynamics, which are incredibly complex.
And hopefully cut through some of the noise, right?
Yeah.
Because there's so much noise around a topic like this, critical, definitely emotionally charged.
Absolutely. It
Yeah.
feels like trying to find specific grains of sand in a huge desert sometimes, doesn't it? Making sense of it all.
Totally. The events just unfold with, breathtaking speed.
Right. And what's really striking and maybe challenging for people listening is how dramatically different the stories, the narratives can be. It really depends on where you're getting your information. So our mission today really is to unpack this latest phase of the Israel-Iran conflict. We've gathered a pretty diverse stack of sources, everything from official military spokespeople, international news reports, even some regional analyses from YouTube channels.
Right. Trying to get that broader picture.
Yeah, to get past those headlines and hopefully uncover some of the really fascinating and maybe sometimes unsettling insights behind it all.
We want to help you, everyone listening, understand what's really at stake here.
And how these shifting sands, as you put it, might impact the bigger geopolitical landscape.
Okay, so where do we start? When this latest phase, this flare-up, really erupted, a lot of what we heard first, at least in many Western outlets, painted a very clear picture.
Israeli dominance, right?
Exactly. A narrative of just overwhelming success, a show of force that seemed, well, almost unprecedented in how precise and effective they claimed it was.
Yeah.
So we started our deep dive there. We looked at a YouTube video, actually, titled, "Israel Owns the Skies."
Catchy title.
It is, and it features Lieutenant Colonel Nadav Shoshani. He's the IDF international spokesperson.
Okay.
And his perspective is, well, to say the least, it's compelling. It sets a very, very high bar for what Israel says it achieved.
Right. So this is the official IDF line, essentially.
Pretty much.
Okay. And what did he detail? What was the core claim?
He talked about what the IDF called a highly successful first salvo.
First salvo.
Okay. This initial wave of attacks designed, they said, to really cripple Iran's capabilities right out of the gate.
And he used some strong language, I imagine.
He did. He stated quite unequivocally that this opening phase was historic.
Historic, wow.
And maybe even more remarkably, especially for military ops, which, are inherently messy.
Always messy, yeah.
Yeah.
Prone to error.
Right. He claimed, quote, "Things did not go wrong."
Things did not go wrong. That's a huge assertion.
It is. Especially when you think about the complexity. Striking deep inside enemy territory like that.
It implies a level of operational perfection. I mean, that's incredibly rare, almost unheard of in modern warfare.
So what's really fascinating, then, is the why behind this success, at least according to the IDF.
Okay.
And it seems to boil down to two main things. The element of surprise and just incredibly meticulous planning.
Right. Catching them off guard.
Yeah. They were operating, and he used this phrase, over 1,000 miles away from their own bases.
1,000 miles. That's a huge distance for complex air operations.
Huge. Against an enemy, he pointed out, 70 times bigger than Israel.
Geographically vast. Yeah.
And one with, quote, great aerial defense systems.
So not an easy target by any stretch.
Not at all. So think about that for a second. To achieve that level of claimed precision, that success at that distance, against such a, formidable opponent in terms of size and defenses.
Yeah, it really speaks to, if their claims hold up, an extraordinary degree of planning.
Right. Intelligence gathering, execution.
It's like trying to thread a needle in the dark from across the street.
That's a good analogy. And hitting it perfectly every time, according to them.
Which leads to the adaptation point, I assume, because things never go exactly to plan.
Exactly. You hit it. The lieutenant colonel really stressed the crucial role of real-time intelligence.
Okay, real time, meaning?
Meaning constantly adapting during the operations, getting info, changing course immediately.
That makes sense.
He even shared this quite vivid anecdote about an Israeli man whose life was apparently saved by a perfectly timed bathroom break during a missile attack.
Seriously? a bathroom break saved him.
Yeah, because it shifted his position just enough, just at the right second.
Wow, okay.
But it wasn't just, a quirky story.
Yeah.
He used it to illustrate a really profound operational reality.
Watch this.
How quickly targets can shift in that kind of dynamic environment.
Right. Things change second by second.
And you need an immediate response, the ability to just adapt your plans on the absolute fly.
So that level of responsiveness where intelligence comes in and is acted upon almost instantaneously, that's vital.
Especially when you're targeting specific people or, threats that are moving quickly.
It really highlights the almost surreal, like minute-by-minute decision-making in modern conflict, doesn't it?
It does. And that dual focus you mentioned, dynamic targets and leadership, seems key here.
So on that note, leadership targeting.
Yeah.
What were the specific claims there?
Well, this is pretty stunning. The IDF claims they eliminated, quote, dozens of the most senior people simultaneously, right in those opening hours.
Dozens simultaneously. That's
very. And they specifically named 4 high-ranked commanders, Brigadier General Amir Ali Hajizadeh. He leads the IRGC Aerospace Force.
Okay, head of aerospace.
Yeah.
Big target.
And Major General Hossein Salami, who's the IRGC's commander-in-chief.
The top guy, wow.
Individuals at, chief of general staff level.
Right.
But here's the kicker. What's even more striking is their claim that these individuals were, quote, higher ranked than Qasem Soleimani.
Higher than Soleimani.
That's the claim.
Wow. I mean, Soleimani's elimination a few years ago, that sent shockwaves.
Exactly. The whole world was talking about it. It dominated headlines for weeks.
So the implication here, from the IDF's perspective, is that this strike, or these strikes, were an even more impactful decapitation.
That seems to be exactly what they're implying, targeting the absolute top tier of Iran's military command.
That's a massive claim. And did they mention anything beyond just the military commanders?
They did. They also claim to have eliminated key scientists for the nuclear program.
Ah, okay. So not just military leadership, but also hitting the strategic program.
Exactly. It goes beyond just disrupting immediate command and control. It suggests this dual focus.
Operational leadership and strategic programs. That's, if true, that's a much broader objective, much more impactful long-term, potentially.
Right. It's like a layered approach to degrading their capabilities. Not just the hardware, the military stuff.
But the brain power behind it, the intellectual capital, especially for something as sensitive as the nuclear program.
Yeah. So if these claims are accurate, it suggests a pretty profound blow
to both their immediate ability to operate militarily and their longer-term strategic goals.
But, the real test of military success isn't just one big impressive strike, right?
Absolutely not. Yeah. It's about sustaining it. Can you keep up the pressure? Can you maintain that advantage over time?
Exactly. And this is where the IDF's claims get, I think, really interesting, because they assert that these initial successes weren't just like flash-in-the-pan moments.
Okay.
They claim they've been able to sustain this operational tempo, to turn what might have looked like a quick hit and run into an ongoing, persistent campaign.
Right. Sustained pressure. That's a different ballgame entirely.
This is where it gets really interesting, I think, because it suggests a fundamental shift in the conflict, moving beyond just an initial blow.
You've absolutely hit the nail on the head there. Because that sustained capability, that's what leads to this crucial shift in terminology the Lieutenant Colonel talked about.
Ah, right. The difference between
air superiority and air supremacy.
Okay, explain that distinction again. It's important.
Yeah, it really is. Think of air superiority as basically having a significant advantage. You can operate pretty freely most of the time.
But the enemy still exists, still poses some threat.
Exactly. They might still be able to challenge you occasionally, maybe get a lucky shot in. But air supremacy, that's the ultimate goal.
That's owning the sky.
That's owning the sky, essentially. It means the enemy's air force, and critically, their air defenses are largely neutralized.
Giving you almost total freedom of action within their airspace.
Near total freedom. And the IDF claimed they made huge strides towards that very quickly. They said they took out 40 of Iran's aerial defense systems just in the first few hours.
40 in a few hours. That's a lot.
Huge number. And then, quote, dozens more as the days went on.
So it suggests a systematic dismantling.
Exactly. A systematic effort to take down Iran's defensive capabilities piece by piece, moving from just having an advantage superiority towards that absolute control supremacy.
And they described how they were expanding the areas they could operate in too, right?
Yeah.
Systematically.
Yeah, that was another key point. Initially, they said it was focused on Western Tehran.
Okay.
But then they claimed they moved deeper, pushing further into Iranian territory.
He used that phrase, peeling the layer of aerial defense.
That's it. It paints a really vivid picture, doesn't it?
It does. Like peeling an onion, layer by layer. Steadily broadening their reach, their operational freedom.
Striking deeper and deeper into what Iran would have previously considered, secure airspace.
Reaching places they couldn't reach before.
Precisely. And they also put a lot of emphasis on real-time missile hunting and aerial defense hunting.
Okay, so not just hitting fixed sites, but actively hunting moving targets.
Actively hunting. The lieutenant colonel gave this really compelling example. Israeli UAVs, drones, spotting a ballistic missile on a truck.
A mobile launcher, basically.
Exactly. A mobile threat. And then creating an entire operation in real time to take it out before it could launch.
Wow, that requires incredible coordination and speed.
It really does. That dynamic targeting capability, where the intelligence is gathered, processed, and acted upon almost instantly while you're already in the air. That's a significant claim of advanced military capability.
It signifies this continuous proactive engagement, not just sitting back and waiting for threats.
No, actively hunting them down. Hunting the missiles, hunting the defenses before they can be used. It demonstrates a really aggressive posture.
Designed to degrade Iran's offensive potential before it even gets off the ground.
Right, and that ties into another big number they threw out.
Which was?
The IDF spokesperson quoted their own claims of eliminating, quote, way above a third of their missile launchers.
Over a third of the launchers themselves.
That's the claim, which they believe has created a significant bottleneck for Iran.
A bottleneck. Okay, so what does that actually mean for Iran's ability to attack if that claim is accurate?
Well, it suggests a really serious degradation, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, even if Iran has this huge arsenal of missiles we hear about.
Right. If they can't launch them because the launchers are gone,
then the missiles themselves aren't an immediate threat.
Exactly. It implies a significant impact on their offensive capacity, turning that potentially large missile inventory into something they can't readily deploy.
So it's not just about reducing the threat level, it's fundamentally altering the strategic math.
It absolutely does. For Israel, if this claimed degradation is real, it implies a reduced immediate conventional threat, maybe allows them to shift some defensive resources.
Right.
But for Iran, if it's true, it forces a strategic rethink. Do they need to scramble to acquire more launchers, develop totally new delivery methods, rely more heavily on, say, asymmetric tactics?
Like cyber attacks or using proxies more?
Potentially. It's interesting, this bottleneck, if real, could paradoxically push them towards less conventional, maybe more unpredictable responses to maintain leverage.
That's a critical insight, actually. How a conventional win in one area can shift the risks elsewhere.
Which really raises a big question. If these IDF claims are, let's say, entirely accurate, how does Iran continue to pose a significant threat in the longer run? What's their next move?
Okay, let's unpack this further then. Because, while the IDF presents this picture of, overwhelming success, almost total control.
Well, a very confident picture.
Other sources we looked at paint a very, very different picture, a frankly concerning picture for Israel.
Right, the counter-narrative.
Exactly. We looked at material from some Arabic YouTube channels like Summary and also Al Jazeera Arabic.
Okay, regional perspectives.
Yeah, and they offer a starkly contrasting viewpoint. These sources are claiming that Iran is, in fact, successfully opening a breach in Israeli air defenses.
Opening a breach. So directly challenging that idea of Israeli air supremacy we just discussed.
Directly challenging it, saying the defenses aren't holding up as well as claimed.
And what's the basis for that claim? What vulnerabilities are they pointing to?
Well, this counter-narrative really zeroes in on a core potential vulnerability, Israel's sophisticated Arrow missile defense system.
The Arrow system, right? That's their top-tier defense against long-range ballistic missiles, intercepting them outside the atmosphere.
Exactly. And the claim is that the inventory for the Arrow interceptors is, quote, running out, facing a critical shortage.
Running out. That's alarming. Where's that claim coming from?
Well, interestingly, this isn't just coming from the regional channels. They cite credible Western sources like the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post.
Okay, so mainstream Western media is reporting on this potential shortage too.
Yes, and citing experts like Tom Carrico, who's the director of the Missile Defense Project at CSIS.
Carrico's a well-respected voice in missile defense. So if he's raising concerns,
it suggests this isn't just a minor logistical issue. It's potentially a critical strategic vulnerability being exposed.
Especially given the sheer volume of fire they might be contending with from Iran.
And then there's the economics of it all, which is just
The
staggering.
cost factor.
Yeah.
Yeah, defense is never cheap, especially high-tech missile defense.
No, but the numbers here are astronomical. According to the Washington Post, Israel is reportedly spending somewhere around $285 million per night.
$285 million a
Yeah.
night just on defense.
That's the reported figure, just for missile defense operations. Now, contrast that with Iran.
Right. Iran, despite decades of sanctions.
They produce their own weapons, often apparently at a lower cost. It's a more centralized, state-controlled economy geared towards this.
So it's like one side is playing defense with incredibly expensive diamond-tipped interceptors.
And the other side is just throwing volleys of much cheaper mass-produced pawns trying to overwhelm the defenses.
That asymmetry in cost.
Yeah.
It's not just about the money, is it? It's a fundamental challenge to Israel's ability to sustain this kind of defense long term.
Absolutely. Iran's ability to produce weapons more cheaply, even under sanctions, lets them potentially wage a war of attrition.
Where the defender, even with superior tech, gets bled dry financially.
Yeah. It turns the conflict from purely military into this economic endurance test. Who can sustain the drain on resources longer?
That's a critical insight into modern asymmetric warfare, isn't it? It's not always about the fanciest tech.
Not if the other side can just overwhelm you with volume and cost.
So what are the implications then, if these interceptor stocks are running low and the cost is so high?
Well, the implications are, frankly, pretty stark. Sources cited in these reports indicate that without immediate and massive U.S. resupply,
Which isn't guaranteed or might take time.
right, Israel could potentially only last, quote, 10 or 12 days.
10 or 12 days, that's an incredibly short time frame.
Imagine that, a nation, even one as militarily capable as Israel, potentially facing this countdown to critical vulnerability, where the very act of defending itself drains its lifeline.
It raises that huge question, what happens after that? What's plan B if the resupply doesn't come fast enough or it doesn't come at all?
It puts Israel in a deeply precarious position, doesn't it? Really reliant on that external support for its core defense.
A vulnerability that Iran is clearly trying to exploit with this strategy.
And it gets even more concerning. There are claims reported in these sources of Israel potentially resorting to selective interception.
Collective interception, meaning what? Choosing which missiles to shoot down.
Exactly, meaning they might actually choose not to intercept certain incoming missiles, letting them hit their targets.
Why would they do that?
If the cost of interception is deemed too high for that particular missile, or if the incoming threat is assessed as maybe less critical than others, hitting a less sensitive area, perhaps.
Wow. That idea. Selective interception.
Yeah.
That's a terrifying strategic choice to have to make. A grim kind of triage.
It's a game changer, isn't it? It suggests a really desperate situation where every single interceptor missile counts.
Forcing them into this calculus of which threat do we let through.
Yeah. The insight there is profound, I think. Even the most advanced, best-funded defense systems have a finite capacity. They can be overwhelmed.
It reveals the immense pressure, economic and strategic, of this kind of warfare, where the adversary can try to win simply through volume and cost disparity.
Forcing these incredibly difficult moral and strategic compromises.
It truly is sobering. And to underscore that drain on resources, you mentioned the volume of missiles.
Right. Israeli Army radio reportedly stated that Iran launched an astonishing number, 400 ballistic missiles, in one phase.
400. That's an immense barrage.
And Israel, according to their own claims cited in the report, intercepted only 120 of those.
Only 120 out of 400. If those numbers are right, that's a lot getting through or potentially being selectively ignored.
Exactly. And what's crucial to remember, as you pointed out earlier, is that each interception isn't usually one for one.
No, often it takes 2 to 3 interceptor missiles fired at each incoming threat just to ensure a kill.
So you can see how quickly that expensive inventory would just evaporate with those kinds of numbers.
It's a massive, rapid expenditure of incredibly costly defensive assets against a far cheaper and seemingly relentless offense.
And adding another layer to this concerning picture, the nature of the Iranian missiles themselves seems to be evolving dramatically.
Okay, so it's not just about the quantity anymore.
It seems not.
Right.
While initially they might have used older systems, maybe to deplete Israeli stocks.
A strategy in itself.
Right. But other sources, including these regional analyses, now suggest they're deploying their new Fatah hypersonic missiles.
Hypersonic. Okay, that's a term we hear a lot now. What are the specifics here?
These are the Fatah 1 and Fatah 2 models. They apparently just entered service in 2023.
It's a brand new tech.
Brand new. And they're described as potentially undetectable by current systems, and supersonic, though hypersonic is probably more accurate, meaning Mach 5 or faster.
5 times the speed of sound or more. And maneuverable.
And potentially maneuverable, yes, which makes them incredibly difficult, maybe even impossible, for current missile defense systems like Arrow or Patriot to reliably track and intercept.
It fundamentally changes the threat landscape, doesn't it? If they can bypass existing defenses.
It moves beyond just overwhelming with quantity to a much more dangerous quality of attack, penetrating the shield. That's a true potential game changer in military tech terms.
Absolutely. This is a critical development, if true. And how are these new missiles affecting Israeli defenses, according to these sources?
Well, the summary channel specifically explains that the sudden and unpredictable nature of these new Iranian strikes.
Unpredictable because they're so fast and potentially maneuverable.
Exactly. It's causing, quote, confusion and errors in the Israeli defense system.
Confusion and errors, like what kind?
Radar errors, human operator errors, technical glitches. Basically, the system is struggling to cope with this new type of threat.
Which suggests an adaptive enemy. Iran isn't just sticking to old methods. They're learning, evolving their hardware and their tactics.
Exploiting vulnerabilities in real time. It's that constant cat and mouse game, but the mouse just got a serious speed upgrade.
Maybe learn some new tricks.
Right. And it's interesting because while the overall missile volume might have decreased recently.
Oh, so fewer missiles being launched per day now.
From maybe 150 a day down to around 25 a day, according to some reports cited.
Okay, that's a big drop.
But the emphasis now, these sources argue, is squarely on the quality shift.
Less quantity, more quality.
Precisely. It's not about overwhelming with sheer numbers anymore. It's about precision penetration, making sure those advanced, hard-to-intercept missiles actually get through.
So a smaller number of highly effective strikes, rather than a huge barrage of less effective ones. A more refined and potentially more dangerous strategy.
That seems to be the argument. And this leads us to where the narratives just clash head-on, creating this incredible fog of war.
Okay, give us the starkest contrast.
Al Jazeera's broadcast, for instance. They boldly claimed, citing their sources, that Iranian missiles have actually destroyed Israeli air defenses.
Destroyed them. Not just degraded, but destroyed.
That was the claim reported, and that, quote, the skies of the occupied territories are now open to Iranian missiles and drones.
Wow. That is the polar opposite of the IDF's air supremacy claim we discussed earlier.
Completely opposite. And Al Jazeera even quoted the IRGC spokesperson.
The Revolutionary Guard Corps.
Yeah, who apparently stated, very provocatively, we will open the gates of hell and urged Israelis to flee quickly.
Strong rhetoric. Pure psychological warfare, too, clearly.
Absolutely. But what's just fascinating here is the absolute diametric opposition in these claims. Owning the skies versus skies wide open.
It makes it incredibly difficult for anyone on the outside, including us, including you listening, to know the full truth on the ground.
It really highlights how information itself is a battlefield in modern conflict.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've laid out these two incredibly different narratives about the direct conflict, the missiles, the defenses.
Right, the tactical, operational picture, albeit a very blurry one.
But what about the bigger players? What about the elephant in the room? The United States. And specifically, given the timing often discussed in these sources, former President Donald Trump.
Yeah, that's a huge piece of this puzzle. The Summary Channel's analysis paints this really vivid picture of Trump's position, describing him as being in an unenviable position.
Unenviable, facing difficult choices, I imagine.
Extremely difficult choices with potentially massive global consequences.
And what was the core dilemma presented for him?
Well, initially, he apparently showed significant hesitation about getting directly involved militarily.
Okay, despite moving assets into the region.
Exactly. He had already moved some really formidable military units nearby, including those B-2 Spirit bombers.
The stealth bombers?
Yeah, capable of carrying that GBU-57B bunker buster bomb.
The MOP. Massive ordnance penetrator. Designed specifically for taking out deeply buried targets.
Yeah.
Like, say, underground nuclear facilities.
Precisely. So the hardware was there, ready to go. But despite that readiness, he reportedly paused things for 48 hours, held back.
For diplomacy. Or just deliberation.
Apparently hoping for a diplomatic window, or at least considering options. It demonstrates this clear internal conflict. Right?
Yeah, tension between having the military might ready and the desire to maybe not use it. Restraint versus action.
It highlights the immense pressure, the agonizing decisions that a leader faces in that kind of volatile situation.
And it sounds like there might have been external pressure pushing him towards action.
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. According to a New York Times report cited by these sources, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu apparently played a significant role in, quote, dragging Trump towards intervention.
Dragging him? How so?
The report claims Netanyahu was initially, maybe, compliant with Trump's desire to hold back or de-escalate.
Okay.
But then something shifted. Netanyahu apparently insisted that the Israeli plan for a strike was ready to go.
He insisted it was ready.
And even, according to this report, raised his voice to Trump during a heated phone call.
Raised his voice to the U.S. president. Wow.
It's fascinating, isn't it? It paints this picture of a really strained dynamic, an ally seemingly pushing quite forcefully a possibly reluctant U.S. president towards direct involvement.
It's a reminder that international relations, even between close allies, aren't always smooth sailing. They can be personal, dramatic.
Far from the carefully worded statements we usually hear.
Indeed. And Trump's initial reluctance, where did that stem from primarily?
Well, it seems deeply rooted in his core campaign promises. Remember, he consistently pledged to end what he called America's endless wars.
Right. Bring troops home. Avoid new foreign entanglement.
Exactly. And his advisors, at least initially, reportedly reinforced this, telling him to, quote, sit back and watch. Avoid direct U.S. involvement.
So a desire to stick to his political commitments.
But then, facing this intense pressure from an ally and the rapidly unfolding events on the ground, it created this severe dilemma for him.
Campaign promise versus perceived geopolitical necessity. A classic presidential bind.
And it wasn't just external pressure pushing back against involvement, right? What about domestically, within the U.S.?
That's another critical layer. Sources report significant conflict in Congress about the U.S. potentially getting involved.
Not just Democrats versus Republicans.
No, interestingly, it wasn't just Democrats who were wary. Even some Republican allies of Trump, and certainly factions within the MAGA movement, were reportedly against the U.S. joining the war, viewing it as fundamentally Israeli war, not America's fight.
And arguing the focus should be elsewhere.
Yeah. On domestic issues, the economy, the massive national debt, arguing against diverting American resources and potentially lives to another Middle East conflict.
That internal division, even within his own potential base, is really striking. Usually, foreign policy crises can unify, but not always.
Which raises that important practical question. Could Trump even get congressional approval for a war if he wanted it?
Right. Can he really go it alone?
Well, Axios reported, according to these sources, that Democrats would need only 5 votes, presumably in the Senate, to block a formal declaration of war.
Just 5. That's a tiny margin.
Tiny. And crucially, those votes were reportedly available, potentially even from some Republicans.
So blocking a war declaration was politically feasible, maybe even likely.
It seems so. It would make a unilateral decision by Trump incredibly difficult politically. He'd face major opposition.
Which essentially means any full-scale U.S. military commitment would need significant bipartisan buy-in.
Support that, according to these reports, just wasn't there.
Okay, so political hurdles. What about practical ones? Resources?
Another huge factor. The economic burden. U.S. missile defense inventories, specifically things like Patriot missiles, were already reportedly depleted to some extent by the massive amounts of aid sent to Ukraine.
Right. The war in Ukraine has been a huge drain on Western military stockpiles.
Exactly. So supplying Israel with the vast number of interceptors and other things they'd need for a sustained conflict, it would be immensely costly.
Adding more strain to an already stretched U.S. defense budget and industrial base?
It's a resource drain America might struggle to afford or sustain, especially with ongoing commitments elsewhere and needing to replenish its own stocks.
So, political opposition, resource constraints. What about strategic risks for the U.S. itself?
Profound risks. A major one highlighted is the danger of losing critical allies in the Persian Gulf if the U.S. directly joined a war against Iran.
Because Iran would retaliate against them, or U.S. bases there.
Both. Iran has issued very clear threats against U.S. bases located in Gulf countries, and they've also reportedly detailed plans to mine the Strait of Hormuz.
Hormuz. Okay, that's the critical choke point for oil shipments.
Absolutely critical. It's incredibly narrow, only about 55 miles wide at its narrowest, and quite shallow, around 60 meters deep. A huge percentage of the world's oil passes through there.
So mining it or even threatening to mine it could disrupt global energy markets massively.
Send shockwaves worldwide. So if we connect this to the bigger picture, U.S. intervention isn't just about Israel and Iran. It's about global energy security, international commerce, the stability of the entire global economy.
The stakes are incredibly high for everyone.
Immense. And it's interesting to trace Trump's reported thinking on the core issue of Iran's intentions.
How so?
Remember, his initial view, apparently based on testimony from his own intelligence chief,
Okay.
was that Iran wasn't actually actively pursuing nuclear weapons. Maybe the capability, but not the weapon itself.
Right, that was the assessment from U.S. intelligence for a while.
But later, according to these reports, he seemed to accept Israel's argument for needing a preemptive strike. He was apparently swayed by what he perceived as an impressive Israeli operational plan.
It's like he saw a dazzling magic trick and forgot his initial skepticism.
That's one way to put it. But that shift in perspective, moving from an intelligence assessment saying no active weaponization to accepting an ally's push for preemption based on an operational plan, that's a really significant insight into how decisions at that level can be influenced.
Perception of capability can sometimes override intelligence assessments, it seems.
It appears so in this reported instance. And then there's that other really controversial decision attributed to Trump.
Which one?
The decision not to assassinate Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei.
Even though they presumably had the capability, especially with assets like the B-2 nearby?
Sources indicate the capability was likely there. But the decision was made not to target him directly, based on this kind of cold, calculated devil-you-know philosophy.
The devil you know, meaning?
Meaning the belief that a known adversary, even a hostile one like Khamenei, might be preferable to the complete unknown, preferable to the potentially more extreme or maybe less rational successor who could emerge from the power vacuum and chaos if he were suddenly removed.
So better to deal with the leader you understand, even if you oppose him.
That was reportedly the logic. The alternative strategy was to eliminate Khamenei's inner circle instead, target his senior commanders, key figures.
Degrade the regime's capabilities that way without risking the unpredictable consequences of taking out the absolute top leader.
Exactly. It's a cold, strategic calculation.
Yeah.
Prioritizing predictable adversity over unpredictable chaos.
Fascinating and chilling. Okay, let's shift focus back to Iran itself for a moment, because beyond just the military actions and the U.S. involvement, there's this whole other layer. The internal dynamics within Iran.
Right. And according to some of these sources, like the Summary Channel again, there might be a fascinating and potentially crucial internal power struggle happening.
It's a power struggle. How so?
Well, there are these claims, and we should stress they are claims from these sources, that Supreme Leader Khamenei has either disappeared from public view recently, or perhaps more plausibly, has effectively handed over his powers or day-to-day control to the IRGC National Council.
Handed power to the Revolutionary Guard Council.
That's the assertion, which, if true, is incredibly significant.
Why? What would that mean, practically?
It would mean that targeting Khamenei himself, assassinating him, would become purely symbolic, not practical, for affecting the war effort, because the real power would have already shifted.
To the IRGC.
To the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, who are widely perceived, both inside and outside Iran, as being far more extreme, more hardline than the traditional civilian government.
So if they're fully in charge now...
It would represent this profound centralization of power within a more radical military ideological body, fundamentally changing who's calling the shots during this conflict and potentially hardening Iran's stance even further.
Making negotiations even less likely, perhaps.
Which ties into another grim point raised in these reports.
What's that?
The alleged Israeli elimination of what's described as the Iranian foreign minister's entire negotiating team.
His negotiating team taken out.
That's the claim cited. If that intelligence is accurate, it basically means there's no one left to negotiate with the Americans or anyone else on the Iranian side, at least no one from the diplomatic track.
Effectively dismantling any potential diplomatic off-ramp, assuming one even existed.
It suggests, potentially, a deliberate strategy by Israel, or elements within Israel, to close the door on a negotiated settlement, pushing things further towards a purely military resolution.
Removing the possibility of talk.
Exactly. But on another front, It's not all one-sided in terms of internal capabilities.
Meaning?
Sources like Summary also claim that Iran's intelligence apparatus has had some recent successes, a resurgence they call it,
Okay. Successes against whom?
against Israeli intelligence operations inside Iran. Reports mention Iran arresting many Zionist spies
Arresting spies.
and also successfully dismantling alleged workshops and transport vehicles linked to Israeli intelligence and sabotage operations.
Okay, so hitting back at Israel's clandestine networks within Iran.
Precisely. If true, this would weaken Israel's ability to conduct those deep penetration operations, to gather that crucial on-the-ground human intelligence.
Which could erode that intelligence advantage Israel seemed to have earlier in the conflict.
It could, forcing Israel to rely more heavily on remote surveillance, maybe satellite imagery, signals intelligence, making those pinpoint strikes against specific individuals or hidden facilities much more challenging.
Right. Okay, so internal power shifts, intelligence battles. Let's zoom back out now to the global stage, because none of this happens in a vacuum.
No, not at all. All these intricate dynamics, they have really far-reaching implications.
So what does this messy, complex conflict mean for the rest of the world, beyond just the U.S., Israel, and Iran?
Let's take Russia, for example. Their position seems quite paradoxical.
Paradoxical how? Gains and losses.
Exactly. On the one hand, there are some clear potential gains for Moscow from this escalating conflict.
Such as?
Higher oil prices. Anything that pushes global oil prices up directly benefits Russia's state budget, which helps fund their war in Ukraine. That's a crucial economic boost for them.
Okay, money. What else?
The shift in global media focus. All eyes on the Middle East means fewer eyes, less attention, less pressure on what Russia's doing in Ukraine. That's a strategic communication win for them.
Diverting the world's attention span.
And then there's the potential for, quote, exhaustion of NATO. If NATO countries, especially the U.S., get drawn deeply into supporting Israel or intervening against Iran.
It diverts military aid, political capital focus, away from supporting Ukraine.
Precisely. It stretches NATO resources thin, which benefits Russia's position in its own conflict.
Okay, so those are the potential gains for Russia, but you said it was paradoxical. What are the losses?
Well, on the other side of the ledger, Russia faces some significant potential downsides too. One is a possible decrease in their overall influence, their footprint in the Middle East.
How so?
If allies like Syria's Assad regime, who rely on Iranian support, are weakened by regional instability, or if Iran's regime itself faces existential threats, that weakens Russia's network of influence in the region.
Right. Iran is a key Russian partner there.
A very key partner. And crucially, Iran is a significant supplier of military hardware to Russia, specifically those Shahed drones and potentially ballistic missiles.
Which Russia has been using extensively in Ukraine.
Extensively. So a weakening Iran, an Iran under attack, an Iran whose production capacity is degraded, that directly impacts Russia's own ability to wage its war in Ukraine.
So they need Iran stable enough to keep supplying them, even while they benefit from the chaos elsewhere.
It's a very complex, delicate balancing act for Moscow. Conflicting interests all wrapped up together.
Okay, what about China? They have huge interests in the region, too.
Absolutely. China's role is also multifaceted. On the economic front, China is Iran's main oil supplier, or rather, a main customer.
Main customer, right. They buy a lot of Iranian oil.
A huge amount. Estimates cited are around 2 million barrels per day of Iranian oil, often described as smuggled oil because of sanctions, usually bought at a significantly reduced cost.
2 million barrels a day. That's massive.
It is. So any disruption to Iran's ability to export that oil due to conflict or tighter sanctions enforcement, that impacts China significantly. Energy security is absolutely paramount for Beijing's economy.
Because they have a strong interest in stability, or at least the continued flow of Iranian oil.
Definitely. Their reliance on that cheap Iranian oil means they have a vested interest in Iran remaining functional, at least as an oil exporter.
However, there's always a however, isn't there?
There often is. The Telegraph reported something fascinating, though obviously quite covert.
Okay.
They claimed, citing intelligence sources, that China has been sending daily military cargo shipments to Iran since this phase of the conflict began.
Daily military shipments. From China to Iran. How?
Apparently via unmarked civilian cargo planes.
Civilian planes carrying military gear.
That's the allegation. These flights are reportedly routed through Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan.
Okay, avoiding direct routes.
Right. Before they apparently disappear from radar near the Iranian border.
Wow. That suggests a pretty robust clandestine supply line.
It does. It suggests China is performing this delicate balancing act. On the one hand, needing Iranian oil and maybe wanting regional stability, but on the other, quietly providing military support to Iran.
Playing both sides, maybe, or hedging their bets.
It looks like a form of hedging, yes.
Yeah.
Maintaining a civilian facade publicly, avoiding direct confrontation with the West, while covertly bolstering Iran's capabilities.
And it wasn't just China involved in these flights.
The report also mentioned Pakistan potentially supplying arms via these same Chinese planes.
Okay, so suggesting a growing, though hidden, network of support flowing towards Iran.
It certainly points in that direction.
And what about other major powers? Europe, the UK.
Well, the UK government has been issuing some pretty stark warnings, talking about a potential storm brewing in the Middle East.
A storm. Strong language.
Yes. And generally, across Europe, there seems to be a widespread expectation, or maybe fear, of U.S. and NATO involvement if the conflict truly escalates further.
So a palpable sense of apprehension among global powers.
Definitely. A belief that this conflict has the real potential to spill over, to escalate dramatically beyond just Israel and Iran, and draw in major world players, fundamentally altering global security.
Which brings us back to that overarching question. With all these incredibly complex alliances, these conflicting narratives we've explored, these deep economic and strategic dependencies, how long can a conflict like this truly remain contained, just between the primary actors?
That's the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't it?
And what does it all mean for the pursuit of global stability when you have so many powerful players involved in this high-stakes, multi-layered chess game, all with diverging interests?
It's a question that just hangs heavy over everything, demanding our attention, demanding we try to understand these layers.
Okay, so we've established, I think, pretty clearly that there are these incredibly divergent views, wildly different facts being presented by the sources we looked at.
Absolutely. It really is a testament to the classic fog of war, how incredibly difficult it is to get a clear, unbiased picture when the stakes are this high and information is weaponized.
Definitely. But despite all those contradictions, Israel's stated long-term goals, at least as articulated by that IDF spokesperson, Lieutenant Colonel Nadav, seem pretty consistent.
Right. What were the core goals he laid out again?
Four main things, basically. First, ensuring no existential threat to Israel from Iran. That's the bedrock.
Kermudle.
Second, preventing Iran from ever developing a usable nuclear bomb.
The nuclear issue. Always central.
Third, significantly degrading Iran's nuclear program, even if not totally eliminating it. He mentioned aiming for maybe 60–90% degradation.
Okay, not necessarily 100% destruction, but crippling it.
And fourth, crippling Iran's ballistic missile production capabilities, which they claim churn out, quote, thousands of ballistic missiles per year.
So remove the existential threat, stop the bomb, degrade the program, and curb the delivery systems. Pretty comprehensive goals.
Very. And Lieutenant Colonel Nadav, he directly connected this whole strategy back to the trauma of October 7th.
How so?
He said, and this is a direct quote again, when an extreme regime vows to annihilate you, they're going to use it sometime. We learned that on October 7th, we have to be vigilant and preemptive.
Wow. So framing preemptive action not just as an option, but as an essential existential necessity.
Based directly on that recent, incredibly painful experience, it's become doctrine we can't wait to be attacked again.
A doctrine born from trauma. That's powerful.
And it's also important, I think, to note Israel's consistent public messaging around this. Their claim that they have no war with the people of Iran.
Right, only with the regime.
Only with the extremist Islamic dictatorship, as they put it. The IDF spokesperson, interestingly, identified himself as an Iranian Jew.
Okay, highlighting personal ties.
Yeah. And he stressed the historical connections between the peoples and pointed to the millions of Iranians who've actually fled the regime over the decades.
So attempting to challenge that common perception of this being just Israel versus Iran, nation versus nation.
Exactly. Framing it instead as a struggle against a specific governing ideology, trying to separate the regime from the populace in their messaging. It's a subtle but significant distinction they consistently make.
It is key to their public diplomacy, absolutely. But we have to come back to that core contradiction, don't we? Especially on the nuclear issue.
We do. Because while Israel, through spokespeople like Nadav, claims their actions have prevented the Iranians from having a bomb, we also have that assessment cited earlier from the U.S. intelligence chief stating, relatively recently, that Iran wasn't actively pursuing a nuclear weapon. Just the capability, maybe?
Right. that fundamental disagreement on Iran's actual nuclear status and intent.
Which raises that incredibly important question for us and for you, everyone listening. Whose assessment do you trust? Whose version of reality is accurate?
And maybe even more broadly, how do you as an individual discern truth in such a high-stakes, high-propaganda environment where information itself is clearly being wielded as a weapon by all sides?
How do you navigate that information battlefield? It's a huge challenge.
It really is. And ultimately, the strategic clash seems to boil down to tempo, timing, preferred methodology.
How do you mean?
Israel, according to Lieutenant Colonel Nadav, clearly desires a short war. He explicitly said they aimed for, quote, 48 hours, then we finish.
A quick, decisive, surgical strike kind of approach. Get in, achieve objectives, get out.
Exactly. Swift conclusion, minimum duration. In stark contrast, Iran.
They seem to prefer the long game.
Reports suggest they seek a long war of attrition, leveraging their advantages, fast size, strategic depth, lower production costs.
To slowly exhaust Israel financially and militarily, bleed them out over time.
That appears to be the strategy described in these counter-narratives. This fundamental difference in preferred timescale, short versus long, makes a quick, mutually agreeable resolution incredibly difficult.
Almost guarantees a prolonged engagement, or at least prolonged tension.
It certainly points that way.
So why should you, listening right now, care about all these intricate details, these contradictions, these different narratives?
Well, partly because you're getting these multiple perspectives laid out here. Hopefully it helps you piece together a more nuanced understanding for yourself, which is just incredibly important in this age of nonstop information overload.
Right. We're not trying to tell you what to think, but maybe offer some tools for how to think about what you're hearing from different sources.
Exactly. And understanding these dynamics, it's not just an academic exercise. It can profoundly impact global stability, as we've seen. It impacts energy markets, the price you pay for gas. It impacts the future of international alliances.
The ripple effects of this conflict spread far beyond the Middle East. They influence strategic choices made by governments all over the globe.
This isn't just news over there. It's a really critical lens for understanding our interconnected world.
And maybe the key takeaway is this. It's not just about discerning what is empirically true on the ground, which is hard enough.
No. It's also crucial to pay attention to what is being said and why it's being said.
Both sides, all sides really, are actively trying to shape narratives, to control perceptions, to rally international support or condemnation.
Recognizing that active shaping of information, that strategic communication, is absolutely key.
Yeah.
It allows you to move beyond just passively consuming information.
It's critically evaluating it, asking who is saying this, why are they saying it now, what narrative does it serve?
That critical lens is essential.
Okay, so as we start to wrap things up on this truly intense deep dive,
Intense is right.
it feels clear that this is a conflict of narratives just as much as it is a conflict of missiles and military hardware.
Yeah, absolutely. We've really explored that core tension, haven't we? Two nations locked in this dangerous conflict, but with vastly different reported successes, vulnerabilities, and, as we just discussed, profoundly different geopolitical implications swirling around them.
It's this incredibly complex tapestry, woven with claims and counterclaims, immense economic pressures, intricate international maneuvering by players like the US, Russia, China.
All contributing to this incredibly volatile and unpredictable situation.
So maybe the final thought we leave you with is this. Given the immense global stakes we've touched on, and given these clear, stark differences in how this conflict is being portrayed by the parties involved, what do you think is the true measure of victory in a war like this? Is it territory? Is it degrading capability? Is it just survival?
And maybe even more critically, looking ahead, can diplomacy actually prevail here? Especially when we hear reports that key negotiators might literally no longer be at the table, and the public rhetoric on all sides seem to leave so little room for compromise.
Big questions. Difficult questions with no easy answers.
And on that note, it just reinforces how clear it is that understanding these complex layers, digging beneath the surface of the headlines, is more important right now than ever before.
We really hope this deep dive has helped you, even a little, to make sense of these shifting sands in the Middle East, or at least giving you more context for the news you see.
Keep asking questions.
Absolutely. Stay curious, keep those questions coming, and always, always try to look beyond the surface narrative.
And if you want to keep getting these kinds of in-depth explorations of complex topics,
then please make sure to subscribe to the Deep Research Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us keep doing this.
until next time, keep exploring.